It almost seems like all the new world-changing things always look weird, and the people behind them are always seen as delusional.
Yes.
Look at Steve
Yes.
Jobs, right?
Absolutely. If you want to be if you want to be early to anything, you kind of got to sound like a schizo.
Our guest today is easily thinking 15 years ahead of his time. But what he discusses on this episode is rooted in the immediate opportunity today. Think of this episode of Lucid Lines as a glimpse into the future and a guide offering you the actionable insights to make that future a hyper abundant one. There are a few conversations I can think of that have the ability to change the course of someone's life. And I believe this is one of those conversations. So with that being said, let's dive right in. Murad, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lucid Lines.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here, man.
For my audience, Murad is one of those rare minds who is easily thinking 15 years ahead of his time. Yet what he discusses is rooted in the immediate opportunity of today. He's a leading voice on how conviction and skin in the game are shaping the future of value and belief. So with that being said, we can get right into this discussion. And if you've never, this might be unlike anything you've ever heard before, if this is your first time listening to this. So Murad, my first question for you is, in this book that comes up, that you mentioned a few times, The Sovereign Individual, it predicted a massive shift where technology would dissolve countries as we see them in this current form today. They empower a new class of people who had complete ownership of their minds. They had a defense against persuasive technology and manipulative narratives that were brought about through things like social media and AI. From your perspective, are these decentralized communities that we're seeing coming together around meme coins and movement coins sort of the first real evidence of this great shift? And what does this sort of network state, or sort of this grouping of people that are everywhere and nowhere, what does that look like to you?
Yeah, so several things here. I definitely agree with the premise that there will be a wave of decentralization in the coming decades, and certain decentralized technologies and decentralized trends will, in my opinion, strengthen the individual. It will strengthen corporations, for better or worse, and it will probably weaken the government, right, at the margin, right, in terms of like transfer of power. That being said, I also think that the next 20, 30 years will be marked by a so-called technological battle, where on one hand you will have the centralizing forces of AI, and on another hand you will have the decentralizing forces of blockchain and cryptography, right? So I think these two fundamentally are going to be at war, right? Technological, spiritual, social war. Fundamentally, AI becomes stronger when there is as much data, compute, and information stored in a centralized place for analysis and for kind of data mining. Furthermore, I believe AI will be so powerful that it will be able to effectively track the individual in the digital world and in the physical world through hundreds of different pathways, right? Which essentially, in many ways, like the panopticon will be stronger by dozens of times compared to even what it is today, right? So essentially we have to ask ourselves, are there any technologies that can counteract this? And I think blockchain and cryptography are just examples of things that can. To your last point, I definitely agree. I think some of the meme coin communities emerging right now are better examples of both DAOs and network states that we've seen from some of the earlier examples. So I definitely believe that, yes.
Wow, I mean that especially on that last point that you touched on there, because this idea of decentralized autonomous organizations was this idea that people could come together around as a community around something they all collectively believed in, but it was almost all managed through a voting system. It was all on chain. I actually had the pleasure of being a project manager for a gaming DAO for about 6 months. And one of the things I noticed is it all sounded like a great idea at first. But what happened is I think the DAO began incentivizing bad behavior. There's bad actors that kind of let them in. I'm kind of curious to know about how the way these movement coins and meme coins, how the way that they're incentivizing good behavior and maybe even disincentivizing bad behavior, which I think is like an upgrade from DAOs.
Yeah, so 2 points here. One point is I really like the fact that we are actually not experimenting with tokenomics in any way. And essentially, I think the best tokenomics is just to have the coins all circulating from day one and no any kind of like yield farming, algorithmic rewards, liquidity mining, nothing like this. Because whenever you have any kind of reward, you incentivize almost like cheapish or low level behavior, right? It's much better if things come purely from the heart. That's first thing. I mean, if people want to tip each other, I think that's much better than doing it at the blockchain level. The second thing is, I think the extreme beauty of some of these movement coins is that there truly is no centralized body that is organizing anything, that is planning anything. It is absolutely emergent, even more than you would think. Very decentralized, very bottoms up. It's crazy because like the total number of times that I've like talked to other SPX 6900 people on topics that actually pertain with like growing SPX 6900 more is like fewer than you would think. And essentially all the initiatives that you see are invented by people like completely independently and pursued by people completely independently. And essentially the beauty here is instead of having any kind of planning committee or like a centralized marketing board or anything like that, the memetics and the culture are so inspiring to people in and of themselves that they are just all doing what they can or kind of bringing what they're good at to the table, that it's just all coming completely naturally, completely decentralized, without it being like, oh, like on this Wednesday we're gonna do this, like this Thursday there's nothing like this. It's like purely, fully emergent, decentralized, international, all over the world. And I think like we're just still seeding the roots of this, and I think we have like so much more ahead of us.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost the way you're describing it is almost like it's a heart-based initiative. Of course, there's like some mind-based stuff, but there's a big heart-based initiative of goodwill, intent, giving to others, helping others. You know, there's SPX groups forming around how to make better editing videos and things like that. These are sort of self-organized behaviors, which I think is really interesting. It's almost like an analogy, like if I invited you over to help me move as a friend, you would be glad to help me move. But if I said, hey, Murad, I'm going to give you $10 to come help me move, now it kind of cheapens the whole deal.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. That brings me actually to my next question, which is around the nature of money itself. Of course, we've seen the rise of inflation. This was in early 2019 with a lot of money printing that happened. I don't think people recognize the effects of that right away, but now people are really starting to feel the effects as things begin to rise, as people realize that their jobs are not meeting their current needs, but never mind that, not able to give them attainable things in the future like a house and a family and things like that. My question is, there's this powerful idea that came from, again, this book, Sovereign Individual, that money is a product of the market, not of the country or the government. And we lived through a period of time where industrial money was printed as paper, fiat currency. We're seeing this play out with things like meme coins and movement coins, where the market is actually, it's almost valuing these things very differently as not industrial paper money. Do you think what we're witnessing is a fundamental change in what society even believes money is, starting with the advent of Bitcoin, of course, but now moving into this, what we call spiritual gold, I think has been mentioned?
Yeah, for sure. I think this era of fiat money that we've been in since 1973, it's essentially kind of like a perversion. And I think our grandkids will look back at this era and be like, I can't believe that you guys had that. Ultimately, all of this will take time, but essentially blockchain-based currencies are going to completely replace fiat money, and I believe that they will replace gold as well. It just takes time, because even though Bitcoin was created in 2009, really it's been part of the zeitgeist only since 2017, which is what, like 8-9 years, and that's not really that much. It takes probably closer to 30 years, 35, like to for those kinds of shifts to happen. It's all a mental thing. It's all a matter of belief. It's all a matter of essentially a certain meme persisting and infiltrating the minds of people for strong enough, for a long enough time. So it's just a matter of time. I do believe that all forms of value, including currencies and many other things, are going to become non-governmental and non-corporate. They're going to be fully decentralized.
Okay, I mean, I think that's almost comes back to the beginning of our conversation where we said there's going to be some countermeasures that people are going to have abilities and ways to create value that may be outside of the systems that have no longer allowed them to do this.
Definitely, definitely. And what you're seeing right now is essentially people with a vision that they're coming together and they're forming these like teams in a decentralized way to essentially act as a countercultural force to a lot of the things that they see in the world that they don't like.
It reminds me of this concept that's been known in maybe esoteric circles or spiritual circles of polarity, that all things must have a polarity. There's two sides of the coin, and that almost what it reminds me of. Like a dark force has come out, it's become overly powerful, and from what it sounds like, what you're saying, there's a counterbalancing force that has to exist for both of these things to actually exist.
Absolutely, and I'm not an expert on the occult, but I will say that there's a great element of manifestation here as well, and there's also a great element of, almost in a similar vein, almost like a parallel reality building, right? And there's a really good quote, and I'll actually quote it to you right now, that I think is very relevant to our discussion. And it says, "An idea can take a life of its own, influencing the thoughts and actions of its creators and attracting new followers to the cause. When enough people focus their intentions and energies on a specific idea or entity, it can take a quasi-independent existence in the collective consciousness, becoming a self-perpetuating force, shaping the beliefs, perceptions, and actions of those who engage with it." And essentially the idea here is that certain mimetic ideas can be so powerful that they almost become like living beings, right? Because they essentially structurally reprogram the brains of people inside and outside of like the living meme, right? And that's their beauty. That's why they called BTC a mind virus. That's why I and many other eons have also referred to SPX 6900 as a mind virus. And when we say mind virus, it's like when you first hear about it, you're like, haha, very funny. Then you hear about it again, you're like, maybe there's something here. Then you hear about it the third time, ideally in a spaced out fashion. You hear about it the third time, you're like, okay, maybe this can go to 1 billion, all right. Then you keep thinking about it in your head, and you're like, all right, maybe 10 billion, maybe 100 billion. And then you think about it more and more and more, and you realize like, this could be a $1 trillion, multi-trillion dollar thing, because it it's essentially, this is the way you think about it. Like the traditional system is a bottle of water, and these new things are another bottle of water. And we're essentially using technology, memetics, and social media to have the water flow from here to here. And that's what we're trying to do. It's very simple. But again, it's all a matter of belief and spiritual buy-in. And I think given the fact that, in my opinion, the ideas are very powerful, and given the fact that, let's be real, 99.999% of the world hasn't heard of it yet. I mean, if even 1% of those people like it, then we're talking about like $1 trillion market caps, really. So it can become much bigger than people think.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in regards to the cognitive sovereign that they mentioned in the sovereign individual, this person who realized that they can control their own thoughts, and their thoughts and beliefs have real tangible, effects in reality and what they can see through their perception. I think is a really powerful idea. There was this what you just described to me reminds me of this thing called the Maharishi effect, which was a experiment they had done that they had a bunch of people meditating together as a collective on a specific intention of creating world peace in a very specific part of the world. And I don't know the exact details of the experiment. They don't can't recall them right now. But what had actually happened is they were able to prove that it was a very large group of people, were able to actually affect the outcomes that happened. It's much further away, like on the other side of the planet, creating a sense of peace. There was like a 28% reduction in crime over 6 months. So that just speaks to what you're saying and the incredible power that belief actually has in shifting reality, not only as an individual, but like when we all come together around something we all really care about.
Definitely, definitely. And, perhaps a less esoteric example, but an example of the power of meditation nevertheless. Some of the Buddhist monks, I believe in Nepal, can walk completely naked, almost closer to the top of the mountain, and they meditate with a wet towel on their backs, and they can bring their own body temperatures to such high levels simply by meditating and focusing on the idea of fire, that they are completely warm and not cold. Essentially, they can manipulate their bodies in ways that would otherwise be considered supernatural. But I guess a less quote unquote a more believable example, I would say, but definitely an example in a similar vein also.
Yeah, wow. And I think we're even coming into an age where there is a lot of, and we're going to talk about this here in a second, this crisis of meaning, pushing people inwards, going on this inwards journey, either finding out who they really are, finding a deeper sense of purpose, or finding other people, like you're saying, that care about something so much that directly sort of affects a certain pain point that they have. And that actually brings me to this idea of the paradigm shift itself, which is the way you describe this water moving into the other one. Traditionally, paradigm shifts were driven by things like big things that were orchestrated, like either by us or other forces, the printing press, climate change. In your view, what are the primary, often maybe even unseen drivers of the changes we're seeing right now? What are these pain points that are being created amongst many people?
I'll widen the scope of the question, and I will share with you my overall framework, not just as an investor, but just as a person thinking about the world, right? I think if you want to be a good investor, you want to combine micro and macro. When we're talking about micro, we're talking about specific assets, and when we're talking about macro, we're talking about outside of the assets, essentially what's going on in the world, right? And if you're smart, you want to be investing in things that can benefit from trends that are happening in the world, right? And so I don't mean to be a doomer, but I mean, and even before I discuss the kind of the more spiritual, at the material level, I believe that over the next 10 to 20 years, you're going to see a lot of change in the world, right? And I just made notes about this earlier, but I'm going to read them out if you don't mind. Essentially, I think you will see rising unemployment at some point, and you will see rising inequality of all kinds. You will see rising money supply, which means that rising inflation, which means rising food prices, which means rising home/rent prices. You will see rising deficits. You will see a rising portion of the population being of older age, which also affects society in a number of ways. I think importantly, and touching more closer to your original question, we've seen and likely will continue seeing rising loneliness, rising childlessness, rising degeneracy of all kinds, rising polarization of society, in many ways rising boredom, from which many people are running away towards less than ideal things, rising unhappiness, potentially mental health issues, rising nihilism and meaninglessness, We're already seeing rising trade wars and various geopolitical tensions, and we probably haven't seen like them to the fullest extent. We'll probably see rising debt, rising capital controls, and of course, like you've already alluded to earlier, there is also a rising sense of meaning being lost, right? So essentially, if you agree with me across the majority of these sort of trends, then you have to ask yourself which, like, okay, regardless of whether you yourself are experiencing any of these things or not, or are affected by any of these things or not, if you're in any kind of financial markets, you have to ask yourself, which assets will, like, because in my opinion, everything I mentioned will probably intensify even more, right? These things, they are not an overnight thing. These are decade-long trends, right? So they'll probably, in my opinion, intensify even more, and I would argue that AI and related technologies, their acceleration will also accelerate these trends. And you have to ask yourself, which assets are going to benefit from this? Right? Which assets are these trends going to be good for? And essentially, I believe that if there are assets that are going to benefit from this, you as both as an investor and also as an individual can stand to benefit by being in those assets early before these trends continue intensifying even more, right? And to put it shortly, I think these emerging blockchain-based decentralized movements such as SPX 6900 are going to benefit from a lot of these things. Why? A, people have demand for a wholesome community. People have demand to belong. People have demand to be a part of something great. People have demand to kind of, at the risk of sounding crude, kind of like put a middle finger up to the system, right? People want to kind of be a part of something crazy. And I think all of those demands and many more are going to continue growing in the coming years, right? So I think essentially, to put it bluntly, some of these blockchain-based assets are going to absorb a lot of this emotion, right? And I think smart people are going to be positioned there in those assets before a lot of that absorption takes place. But I think even smarter people, they're not only going to be positioned in these assets, they're also going to contribute to them kind of becoming bigger also, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you even touched on this in a previous interview. That you were talking about this idea of the decline of uniqueness. And, everything's becoming the same. And this idea that everyone is becoming the same, I think, plays a big part into some of these factors of not feeling like an individual or not feeling like you're contributing towards something bigger. So maybe it's been a long time coming that we needed some sort of countercultural movement like this. Because growing up as a millennial, I don't recall any large, maybe there are, but not in my experience, seen very large countercultural movements where a group of people came together around something, resonated so deeply, but also still had this flexibility of having this type of uniqueness, where they could each contribute to it in their own unique way as an individual.
Totally. And actually, I think this is an advantage of a mimetic movement more than technical projects, because here I would argue that the design space for contribution and it's much more of a blank canvas, and anybody can contribute in their own ways. Because we have artists, we have engineers, we have DJs, we have so many different kinds of people, and they are all contributing in their own way. And I think that's very beautiful.
Yeah, actually, yeah, absolutely. I have a question about archetypes here. When you look at these people that you mentioned that are drawn to these kinds of movements, what are sort of the psychological archetypes you're seeing? The warriors, the artists, the builders.
I love this. I love this topic. I love this topic.
And maybe what is even the psychological difference between someone who thrives in this world? I think we touched on this a little bit. Someone who thrives in this world versus someone who fears it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I actually have a theory that I'm developing, and it's going to sound very crazy, very redundant, maybe. Maybe some people will even be offended, because people say whenever you try to categorize people into any kind of archetypes, people say no, like there are actually there are actually 8 billion archetypes in the world. You know what I mean? But I have a theory, right? And I'm probably going to talk about this a year later, because I don't want to delve into sociology too much these days, but eventually I'll expound upon it in a more detailed way. But here goes. I strongly believe, very strongly believe, that there are only 3 kinds of people in this world. There are frameworks with 16 archetypes, frameworks with 6 archetypes. I strongly believe there are only 3 types of people in the world. And this is this is gender neutral, this is race neutral, this is geography neutral, class neutral, religion neutral. I think it applies to all human beings. And I suspect it is both biological and cultural, and they all play a role. And essentially, I think there are 3 buckets of humans, and society, both biologically and culturally, kind of self-filters people into these 3 buckets, right? So, and again, it applies to both men and women, right? So first archetype is the warrior, right? I think these are people that are, very statuesque, very physically strong. They're very stubborn in terms of personalities. They are persistent both like physically and emotionally. They have high levels of resilience, and they are the ones that the great sculptors would build sculptures around, right? They are likely the most physically beautiful, and a lot of athletes, models, people that essentially can use the body to their advantage, I think they belong to that group. The second group is, you can call them nerds. I call them project managers, for kind of political correctness
Intellectuals.
purposes. Right. Intellectuals, engineers, they are the ones that fit into this category. Essentially, they are what people jokingly refer to as the autists at one level or another. They often have, OCD, anxiety, but they are the ones who are into, chess, Rubik's Cube solving, programming, analysis, trying to, understand things at a deep level from first principles, etc. You get the idea. Mm-hmm. And there's the third group, which, you can call them artists, hipsters, people that are more spiritual in a way, people that are more artistic. They usually, they're less autistic, maybe more schizo. If I had to this is a crude oversimplification, of course, but you get where I'm going with this. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones that they're the creators. They create the music, they create the art, some of the great literature, etc. Right? And I think
very right-brained individuals.
Yes, definitely. And I think that you can, and by the way, I think certain countries have more of some of archetypes and less than others. And essentially, I think you can understand history through the interaction between these archetypes. And I think SPX 6900 attracts a lot of the latter 2 categories. Specifically, I think it has I consider myself obviously more of the second category, but I think I've noticed SPX 6900 in particular attracts a lot of people from the third category as well, and some people in the second category also. The problem with the second category is that a lot of nerds, they tend to be kind of cold and a bit soulless. At the worst extreme, even sociopathic, kind of not quite in touch with their emotions and feelings, and as well as feelings of others, right? And I think that SPX 6900 is kind of an EQ play, and in order to really understand not just the investment thesis, but really the community and the project itself, you have to be a bit more in touch with your emotions, but also others, right? And so, Yeah, I think we've attracted a lot of the second and third category so far. Crypto overall, I don't think it has a lot of the first kind of people full time. You know, the first category kind of comes and goes. But yeah, the second and third category is the kind, at least in my framework, that I see a lot in SPX 6900.
Do you think being part of these communities, coming in as a certain type of archetype, if you're leading strong against one, there's actually sort of an integration process that maybe happens where you become just being around other types of people, let's say being a really intellectual, but now you're hanging around artists because you all believe in the same coin. Do you think there's like a effect of rubbing off on each other? Because there's almost this idea of if you're very much intellectual in the mind, you're disconnected from the heart, you actually, in a sense, this is something I talk about on my channel, is this idea of heart-mind coherence. The two things working together to, for lack of a better word, make you a whole human being. Both things are essential. So I'm wondering if, if somebody comes into a community like this movement coin SPX 6900, and they are a very intellectual person, if you're seeing those people maybe open up a little bit more, maybe try and dabble in a little bit of art and things like that.
Definitely. I see myself in it because I kind of am, as I said, consider myself more as a category 2, but I think I've been getting elements of category 3 like for myself as well while I'm in SPX 6900. I think ultimately a good, like the most powerful community is going to have all three kinds of people, because you need all three kinds of people to essentially communicate to their respective tribes. That's why actually a lot of the SPX 6900 OGs, I think they're also category 3, and they focus on spirituality, belief, community, resonance, frequencies, things like that. I think I've been a person that has brought more category 2 people on board as well, because I try to kind of explain things more like logically, like more robotically as well. It's like this happening, this trend is this happening, that's why this flow is going to occur, etc. Right?
Like a flow chart.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Like but ultimately, we need all three. We need all three so that every tribe can see themselves and people like themselves in the movement and be more likely to join.
So, I mean, speaking of tribal movements, are we seeing this sort of maybe as even a re-emergence of tribes? As if we look back in history, we were always tribal creatures. We had our cliques. We would do dealings with other tribes. We would do trades with other tribes. We would learn from each other. Because I'm also seeing this between meme coin communities and movement coin, especially the dominant ones, sort of this idea of unite the memes. And I'm just curious to know if we're seeing the emergence of tribalism, but in maybe a healthier fashion than even it was before, a non-violent fashion of being sort of digital tribes of the modern age.
So, this is a great question, and I'll tell you why. I actually had a very good conversation with another gentleman about 6 or 7 hours ago, and we spoke on a very similar topic, and I think it bears, I would love to share some of the discussion from there as well. So, and it was exactly about tribes. So I said, the reason, believe it or not, I believe that the reason for the growing unhappiness of people, the rise of mental health issues, the complete collapse of fertility, complete collapse of family formation. Obviously, all these things are connected, right? You don't need to be a genius to understand this. And my view, and a lot of people online debate why is this happening. And I have a theory of my own. And my theory is very simple. It's because society became wealthier. And I'll explain you what I mean by this. And I will actually preface this with really one sentence. And I'll say, excess dulls the soul, right? And what I mean by this is this. For not millennia, for millions of years, human was a tribal creature. And unfortunately, society has become so wealthy. And when I say wealth, I don't mean money this, money that. What I mean is because everybody has, well, not everybody, right? I'm talking predominantly about, I'm talking from the privileged standpoint of like a first world perspective, right? But the reason for the rising kind of mental health issues of a lot of people and sense of alienation, particularly in the first world, and it will eventually happen in the second and third world as well. All civilizations go through these phases, but it's the following. It's now, essentially, you can survive you can survive without your village. You can survive without your family. You can survive without your partner. You can survive without your children. The problem is, in millennia past, you literally needed, at the life or death level, your community in order to survive and thrive. But now, you essentially, you get your food delivered with barely any form of human contact, and then you numb yourself with, TikTok shorts or some bullshit on YouTube, and ultimately, you go to your job, which is really just meaningless in 80% of cases, just shifting stupid numbers around. And really, the reason for people's unhappiness is because they lost the human touch. They lost human connection. And I believe this is the root cause of a lot of the problems in the world. Because ultimately, fundamentally, what people want is they don't want big house, big cars, or anything like that. What they want is to be seen, to be loved, to find intimacy, to be understood, to be adored, to be respected. And when you're living alone in your single studio apartment, which is, by the way, increasingly the case for a growing percentage of people around the world, you don't get that. And that's what's happening. And I think social media, by the way, is 1,000 times worse than even the biggest critics paint itself as, because the more you consume social media of all kinds, by the way, you essentially, there a lot of people mistakenly think that they're behind, they're falling out of the race, they're not living this glamorous life that other people are living. It's extremely toxic, and it further contributes this flywheel of unhappiness, this vicious cycle. And I genuinely believe that, like I kind of jokingly say that, I genuinely think that like lower class person in Africa is sometimes happier than a salaryman in Korea or a salaryman in Japan, because like they still have like community, they still have like a wife, kids, whatever, like, you know what I mean? They're still living life in this like ancestral terms. Maybe they live a shorter life, but I think they have more of these like emotional, and they're living life in a more real way, you know what I mean? In a more authentic, genuine way. And so this is the core crux of the problem of modern society, right? I'm talking about the first world again. You have fewer people starving, but now the forms of suffering have shifted higher on the Maslow's pyramid, right? We have less starvation, but we have more spiritual starvation. And I think that that's like one of the 19 reasons why I'm very bullish for SPX 6900, which even if it doesn't solve this fully, it definitely solved this partially. And that's already very, very valuable, right? And all of this is in line with, growing nihilism in the world, growing skepticism, cynicism, decline of spirituality of all kinds. And I think, SPX 6900 is kind of like, when you see a flower growing in the middle of concrete, that's like the way I think about it. It's like this glimpse of hope and glimpse of wholesome culture in the world. And I genuinely think, like, not to pat ourselves on the back or anything, but I think the reason for SPX success and its continued success in the future is because so far it has attracted disproportionately really like good, clean, wholesome people. And I think people sense that, like through media, through text, through artwork, through podcasts, through videos. People sense this and they want to join this because essentially, like Vaporol says, like being kind is gangster now. And essentially, I think like we live in a world without counterculture, and I think kind of like wholesomeness is becoming the new counterculture. And also flipping the stock market is also very countercultural. We haven't seen anything as like financially crazy and ambitious as this. So all of these like different factors, I think they come together in SPX 6900, and that's why I'm very bullish. Yeah, that's kind of like how I think about it.
That's awesome. And one thing I picked up on there, well, many things, but one of the things that stood out to me here just now is this idea of the dominant emotions being held by these communities, the vibes, as many people would just call it, right? And energy, the word even emotion, being energy in motion, right? Emotion, if you look at the word, is like energy in motion. And so it's like, what kind of energy are we actually putting into motion by sharing? Like, what part do you think collective emotions play into this? Because I'm seeing a huge trend there.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like some of the coins are more like Gryffindor, and some are more like Slytherin. Uh, you know. If you know, you know. But you know, SPX and thousands of people I've seen tweet. SPX 6900 is kind of like, it's about warmth, it's about sharing, it's about patience, it's about long-termism, and it's about like doing things the opposite of what the zeitgeist wants you to do. Like, they want you to trade, they want you to gamble, they want you to like think short term, they want you to like be desperate. But SPX 6900, it teaches that essentially if we unite together and build something real, slow and steady, we're actually going to outperform everybody. And I think this is beautiful because this is kind of like finance and spirituality are merging into one. And I know this is the topic you're very passionate about as well. But essentially, I've said this 18 months ago. My view is that spirituality is getting tokenized. Now, I know this sounds insane because people are like, oh, bonds are getting tokenized. Oh, like treasuries are getting tokenized. Real estate is getting tokenized. But I think that shit is boring. What's boring is like the crazy stuff, the unique stuff, the weird stuff, the schizo-sounding stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's where the actual, both interesting stuff is culturally, and also interesting stuff is as an investor. And if I sound like a crazy person, that's good, because that means that it's not consensus yet, which means that we're still like 1000x away from consensus. And what is interesting to me isn't tokenizing the tangible things like buildings, which I think is absolutely fucking boring. What I think is interesting is tokenizing the intangible things. The tokenization of pure concept, the tokenization of ideas, the tokenization of ideologies, the tokenization of spirituality, the tokenization of faith and belief. And I think SPX 6900 in many ways is pioneering this. It's like, it's still so early. Like, I think months, years from now, you will see people just start to talk about this. Some people are getting a glimpse of this. There are a couple of Substacks that are starting to see the light. But it's always better to be early, you know what I mean? And I think it's much more interesting to tokenize the intangible. And that's what SPX 6900 is doing. It's tokenizing belief, which I think is like, here's the thing. It's such a big market, right? People think, oh, it's just a joke, right? It's so silly. But really, if you think about it, and I've spoken about this in my last video on YouTube, but a lot of VCs on Twitter, they always debate one another, like what's the biggest market, and and I'm talking even about Web 2, right? Some people say, oh, it's like military is the biggest market, and someone says no, food is the biggest market, and some people say no, energy is the biggest market. No, someone says no, transportation is the biggest market, and even in crypto. Some say, oh, like money is the biggest market. And someone says, no, payments is the biggest market. And no, the exchanges, the centralized, decentralized exchange is the biggest market. But actually, my view, and I kind of touched upon this earlier, but my view is actually the biggest market in the world, and this is more from like a Buddhist point of view, right? I think actually the biggest market in the world, and that's actually the market that oversees all other markets. The biggest market in the world is to reduce psychological suffering. I think that's the biggest market in the world. I think it's like in the hundreds of trillions, maybe more. And if you can solve that market, even like by 1%, That's how you're talking about trillions, right? And ultimately, again, we can talk about like physical things, right? But ultimately, like the reason we don't live to drink, we drink to live, you know? And I think that if you can essentially TLDR here is that if you can satisfy people's bodies, you can be big. If you can satisfy people's minds, you can be bigger. But if you can satisfy people's souls, you can be gigantic. You know what I mean? And so this is the power of these tokenized communities. If you can give people a glimpse of hope, a glimpse of brotherhood, a glimpse of friendship, a glimpse of meaning, again, even if you're not like solving it 100%, if you're just solving it by 1%, I think that's the biggest market in the world, much bigger than anything physical.
Wow. I mean, I don't know if anybody could have said it better themselves from a even spiritual, psychological, financial standpoint. And it almost seems like all the new world-changing things always look weird, and the people behind them are always seen as delusional.
Yes.
Look at Steve Jobs.
Absolutely. If you want to be early to anything, you kind of got to sound like a schizo.
So, for anybody by now, understands the mission, understands where this is going, the state of the world, putting it in a clear lens, to join a movement like SPX or some of the other movement coins, what does a person really need to have to do? What is the minimal activity to join a movement like this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Even if the overwhelming majority will just buy and hold and not do anything else, there's like levels to it. And I actually think that we're entering an era of what I call like more active or more participatory investing, where you don't just buy and hold, you also like do stuff to make the asset bigger. So I think ultimately there's a whole list of things you can do, but buy, hodl, diamond hand for as much and as long as you can. DCA is almost like a ritual in our community, right? And create media, create artwork. Essentially, the correct way to do it is all of us have unique skills and unique backgrounds, and everybody can contribute in different ways. So, for example, me, I think because of my like debate background and other stuff like this, I'm pretty good at like making presentations and kind of like describing things and trying to like analyze the world and the changes in society. And so I try to like bring that, right? A software engineer can bring a website that like puts a lot of these things together. A musician can build like music, and a videographer can make videos, etc. Right? So everybody can contribute in their own respective ways.
Okay, yeah, no, that puts it together for anybody who's listening at this point and is interested. These are some of the ways to just either starting at buying it, holding it for as long as possible, buying in regular intervals, whatever is reasonable for you, and then of course being involved in the community and actually actively contributing and growing the meme, the culture, spreading the vibes in whichever way you can. Now we're getting to the end here. I have sort of some lighthearted questions, a couple lighthearted ones here. Aliens. I don't know what your belief is on that, but if there is some sort of civilization out there that is watching us, what do you think they believe, or what do you think they see about this sort of thesis on meme coins, movement coins? Of course, they are not subject to many of the distortions and the way we think on this planet, right? How would you think they'd be looking at this from the outside, if you even believe in such a thing? I'm just genuinely curious.
Yeah, great question. There's quite a parallel. First of all, I do believe in aliens. I think the vastness of space is just way too big for, probabilistically speaking, I think they exist. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think there's a parallel between aliens and AGI. And I jokingly say, the next question isn't whether government will buy BTC. The next question is whether AGI entities will buy BTC. because the government will obviously buy it. So the question is, when we get to AGI, right, and that's very similar to aliens in a way, are those guys going to buy our latest strongest currency, or are they going to create their own and then force us to use that? So I think I genuinely think that's a very big question. But if we were to if they were to have to, for some reason, in a hypothetical sense, if they had to buy the existing stuff, I genuinely think they would buy BTC and SPX 6900. They would buy BTC for like defense and SPX 6900 as offense, essentially.
To know, maybe get a sense of what it feels like to be human, to even a small degree. Maybe.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, the game theory is just buy strength, I think. So that's what they're gonna do.
You say you spend 2 hours outside every day. You had a little chalkboard thing you put up a little while ago. What are you doing during these 2 hours? Of course, we know spending time outside, touching grass is a general statement.
Yes.
But what is your activity that you're doing out there?
Yes.
If anything, maybe walking.
I'm literally obsessed with walking. I think all my best ideas come from walking. I'm not the first one to, like, a lot of people throughout history have noted the power of it. I do think essentially your probability of getting into a flow state or a meditative state of various kinds increases significantly during a walk.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of my favorite activities too. I live close to a river. I love walking by there in the morning and being part of nature for a little bit. Lastly here, do you have a question for me? Is there anything that came up during this interview or even outside of this that you may have wanted to ask me?
What brought you to SPX 6900 and what do you like about it in particular?
For me, it was rooted in a pain point. First of all, as a paramedic for 8 years, I've seen human suffering at a very broad and also very specific level. I've seen it span across, through things like opiate crisis, through many sociological levels, that it actually defies what we see on the news, that it actually, I've seen, lawyers and doctors be subject to this as much as somebody living on the street. It's behind the curtains view of what suffering looks like. And so that's actually what drew me into crypto, first of all. But then there was a disappointment that followed, that crypto was not living up to its eluded promise, maybe you could say. That maybe BTC, you could argue, fulfilled to some degree. But, getting into altcoins and then crypto gaming, there was nothing to be found, the sense of community and this vibe that you could say. And it wasn't until, I saw these meme coins, movement coins, specifically your talk in Token 2049 in Dubai last year, that it really started to make sense for me. At the time, I was making videos on a DAO-based channel, but my heart wasn't in it because I'd worked for the DAO. I'd been screwed over many times through, them incentivizing bad behavior. So there's this continual search. This, you could even call it like in an RPG, like an adventure, that not the hero, but even the person going through the adventure is continuously disappointed until they find the gold, and to me, finding these communities, the thesis that you're putting together directly hits on a lot of the points I've seen behind the scenes when I was working as a paramedic, and again, going through my own mental health journey, that I thought this is really the answer. This is something that people need. This is the antidote, the sort of what I even call the medicine that people could have in an age where it's nowhere else to be found. And maybe these other factors creating the pain points will become even more intense.
I totally agree with you, and I've gone through a similar journey myself.
So again, thank you for joining me on this episode today. I'm incredibly grateful we could have this sort of flowing conversation. And to anybody else who is interested and wants to dive deeper, I'll list the resources down below. I'll list Murad's socials so you can dive deeper into this phenomenon that's happening. Thank you, everybody listening to Lucid Lines, and until next time, peace.